Michael Benjamin is a founding member of Biostasis Technologies and is currently the operations manager, secretary, and treasurer. He was previously a research associate at Advanced Neurobiosciences, joining the company in April of 2019. He worked on a comprehensive meta-analysis of all Alcor patient cases, an endeavor whose goal is to develop, experimentally validate, and refine a quantitative cryopreservation evaluation methodology. Michael brings within 20 years of experience in physics, engineering, and mathematics, having worked at places such as NASA, Goddard Space Flight Center, the Brookhaven National Labs, and Lockheed Martin. Michael Benjamin, welcome to the Cryonics Underground.
Thank you for having me.
If you can tell us, just for the listeners and the viewers out there, a little bit about your background and your career to get us started.
Yep, sure. So I've tried a bunch of different things. When I got out of high school, I had no idea what I wanted to do. Spent a few years driving a truck for a medical supply company, did various jobs. About 10 years later, after high school, decided to go back to school for computer science. Took a physics course and fell in love with the physics and ended up with a degree in physics. Did some internships and some graduate work while at NASA. Working on solar physics. Ended up having to come back to New York. Started a master's degree in physics teaching, did a couple of years of that. And then one day Lockheed Martin comes along and says, while I was doing my graduate work and some of my undergraduate work, I worked out of Brookhaven on material science, studying batteries for JPL, for space missions for JPL. While in grad school, Lockheed Martin comes along and says, do you want a job? I said, yeah, sure, why not? So I ended up going to Lockheed Martin. I worked on radar systems at Lockheed Martin, on their Aegis system, naval radar system. But I was always interested in space. So I started looking around at Lockheed for jobs in the space sector. And long story short, I ended up in space operations for a couple of years. Moved out west, spent a couple of years doing that, and then moved back east to DC and got more into the program management, project management side of things. And so that was around 2006 to 2008. And then around 2012, I had some health issues, and I decided to come back to New York. To be closer to family, closer to my support system. And I was sick for a number of years. And fortunately, the autoimmune condition I had, I'm not going to say went into remission, but calmed down. And I ended up going back to work. Interestingly enough, being this is New York, there's no space jobs in New York, and I wanted to stay in New York. Actually, there are people working on trying to get space jobs in New York. I do some work with them now, actually. But the most immediate job was artificial intelligence, but in the legal profession. So I ended up doing about a year working in that industry, and I met Ashwin DeWolf in the meantime. And Ashwin spent about 6 months convincing me to come to work for Advanced Neurobiosciences, to work on this Alcor meta-analysis project. We finally agreed after about 6 months of discussing it, and I came on board with Advanced Neurobiosciences. And sort of the rest is history. I worked for A&B for, I guess it was 2019, April 2019. So about 40 years. Right, 3.5, 4 years before I transitioned over to Biostasis Technologies. So the meta-analysis project was slated to come to an end at the end of 2022. Most of the data has been collected for that project. And now we're just writing up the reports and doing the analysis. Should have that time at the end of the year.
We're going to get into all that. I want to go back for a second to the NASA and the Brookhaven and Lockheed Martin. So Cryonics has its fair share of space buffs. So I kind of have to ask, are there any like particularly interesting or notable stories that stand out from your career with one of those organizations?
Nothing I can really talk about, at least in this, most of the space related stuff. I still do some space consulting. I just worked on a project doing some orbit analysis for a company out in California.
Oh, cool.
So I still do keep my fingers in that pond. But the NASA work. So I was working as an intern at Goddard Space Flight Center down in Maryland, working on solar physics. Actually, that mission, that satellite just came down about 2 months ago. I think it reached its end of life a few years ago, but it finally came down. There was a whole big thing that they thought it was going to crash into something, but it didn't. And so what happened when I was at NASA, they offered to pay, my mentor there offered to pay for the first year of my PhD. And I was going to do my graduate work at Catholic University. That's who had the contract with the program I was on. So long story short, I moved down there, and a few weeks later, NASA had huge budget cuts. So that's why I ended up moving back to New York at that time to pursue some graduate work up here at Hunter College.
Okay. And how did you originally get interested in cryonics?
As often, at some point in your life, you start to think about death, right? When you're younger, you generally don't think about it. I know Emil Kenziro is working on changing that to get the younger generation to sign up for tomorrow biostasis. But, it was basically when I had part of the process of confronting my mortality. I had a cancer diagnosis first before I got this autoimmune diagnosis. Fortunately, the cancer was an easy one to take care of. But, it just started the wheels turning on thinking about mortality. And I don't remember exactly how I first came across cryonics, but I did join as an associate member for Alcor. I think it was about 3 or 4 years before I actually signed up as a member. And here we are.
And what years was that?
So 2017, I signed up as a member, and probably 2 or 3 years before that, I was associate member. It was 2017, I became a full member.
And were your, if you don't mind me asking, the name of your autoimmune disorder, I believe it was scleroderma.
Scleroderma, yes, that's right.
Scleroderma, yeah, that's a weird.
I do some advocacy work for that, for some of the scleroderma organizations as well.
Okay, and what are the kind of effects of that on your life physically?
So it's a autoimmune connective tissue disease. So long story short, the body creates excess collagen, which creates excess scar tissue, and it can happen anywhere in the body. In general, there's places where it affects more than others in most people who have it. Hands, for example. It can affect any internal organ in the body. The skin it's named after, scleroderma means hard skin. So it affects the skin, obviously, causing scar tissue and tightening of the skin. But it can also affect internal organs like the heart and the lungs, and I have some effects on those things. But you sort of play whack-a-mole with all these things to try to make sure things stay as stable as possible and functioning as possible.
Yeah, and I guess previously you had mentioned something about your concerns with stabilization in regards to for cryonics in regards to scleroderma. What exactly are the concerns there?
So scleroderma also affects the vascular system. It attacks the endothelial cells in the walls of the vein, of all your veins and arteries and all that. And that affects blood flow and can affect other things with regard to the cardiovascular system, which may or may not, and it's I've been looking at it peripherally, affect perfusion.
Hmm.
It causes lack of blood flow in the hands. So there's something called Raynaud's phenomenon, where your hands, when they're exposed to what at least your body thinks is cold. So for me, it's 65 degrees or colder, circulation stops in my hands. So the capillaries spasm in the extremities, in the hands, in the feet, and that can also happen in the brain. So as you're cooling and you're perfusing somebody, I don't know if you're still going to have that Raynaud's effect, where the capillaries and some of the veins are going to spasm in the hands, in the brain, wherever, while you're being perfused and cooled down at the same time. So I think that's something that needs to be looked at.
And I'm curious, since we're on that topic, are there other types of conditions that people may not be aware of that can affect stabilization in the same way? Whether it's a disease or, I mean, in my mind, I would assume, like, if you have like very just generally bad vascularization due to like age or being highly overweight or something along those lines. I'm wondering if there's any particularly notable things people should actually know about that.
I think that any cardiovascular condition in general can cause problems, and depending on what the condition is, they can cause different problems. It's common for autoimmune conditions, certain autoimmune conditions, to cause similar problems as to what scleroderma causes in the vascular system. I think lupus has some similar effects. But I think any cardiovascular condition can potentially cause problems with perfusion.
So, Mike, I want to now drop us into the meta-analysis and your work on this meta-analysis and for Alcor and how it came about. So, where did the idea for this meta-analysis come from? I guess, was it Auschwitz who brought it to you, and then how did you decide to get involved in this? Why did you feel like you were the right person to get involved with this?
Yeah, I'm not sure about the genesis of it, but I know Auschwitz. My understanding is that Auschwitz was a big supporter of this. I don't know if it started Alcor, if it's something that Auschwitz came up with originally, but I'm sure Auschwitz and many other people realized that there was really a lack of understanding on a large scale of what was going on with how successful have these cryopreservations been. I don't think there was a deep enough understanding. There's always this push to improve procedures, but I don't think there was a deep understanding of if things were actually improving, even with the new technologies and the new procedures, on a macro scale.
So before Alcor engaged you guys to help make this a reality, was there any kind of digital database of all the different metrics and factors here, or was everything like in pieces of paper in a fold filing cabinet somewhere?
Basically, pieces of paper in a filing cabinet. They had they had digitized some stuff, but not any sort of database or anything like that, as far as I know.
And so, when you were getting started with this, what was the date that you wanted to first start looking at for this? What was the earliest date? And then
I'm basically looking at all the case reports and all the data that came along with the case reports, temperature data, anything that's done during the entire process, any data that was available. The earlier you go back, the more lacking the data was in many cases. So it was a lot of, collecting whatever data I could. And then in terms of the analysis, it's sort of piecing things together and trying to fill in gaps without, making things up, obviously.
And what were the earliest dates that you feel like you could get reasonable data such that you felt comfortable putting it into a database?
It was kind of up and down, but I would say by the late 80s, early 90s, they had been collecting some really decent data. I would say the early 90s, things really started to become more thorough. But, as different people come and go, the quality of the reports and the data collected and the data saved goes up and down as well. So there's a lot of variation in that.
And so you wouldn't say that was because of the technology. You would just say it was because of the kind of internal Alcor policies or whoever was,
Yeah, I would say it's, whoever was doing things at the time.
And so what were the factors that you felt were most important when you were looking at this database, right? So there's probably a list of a lot of different metrics that you thought were going to be relevant in all this. Were there some that you thought, okay, I could start collecting? Here are the 4 or 5 that were actually available in, say, the early 80s or such, but then maybe by the 2000s you had like access to 10 or 12 of these various factors.
I think probably one of the most important times is stabilization. Obviously, when you have standby, you're in much better shape because you're there as soon as the patient deanimates and get the procedures going right away. But I think one of the more important periods is the stabilization, how quickly the patient is cooled down, what procedures are done at that time, what is lacking in a lot of cases, particularly in the earlier cases, is temperature data for that period, and that creates some other challenges. For example, the S-mix, which we'll probably talk about a little bit later.
Yeah, that'll be a whole, yeah.
Yeah. Which is just to explain briefly right now is a measure of ischemic damage in a patient during a cryopreservation.
So, were there numerous factors that you wanted to keep track of in this database that weren't directly relevant to the overall quality of the cryopreservation? For example, whether or not the medical personnel were helpful and cooperative in the patient's case, or things like that. Other things that might be useful to track, to have some sense of how well Alcor is doing in one way or another, or where they should be putting resources, but which maybe aren't directly relevant to the overall outcome.
Well, one of the most important things is time. The quicker you get the cryopreservation done, the better. And any human interaction, whether it be medical personnel or what have you, affects how long this process takes. That's actually, and I can talk about that in a little bit. I'm working on writing up a number of reports on different areas of different periods of the cryopreservation, and one of them is, how did hospitals cooperate with the standby team or hospices, and how that affected the timeline. So we're looking at details like that as well. So I think, there's so many different pieces of this that affect the timeline, that affect the quality of care. So I think every piece of data, no matter how insignificant it seems, it can be important in some way. And I don't think that'll be completely understood until we get through this analysis. And frankly, I'm doing the work that I'm doing, but I think this data collection is going to create years of analysis to understand this whole process.
And to get an understanding of, when you're saying like interruptions and things like that, how granular was some of this kind of data? Were they recording, or was it someone taking notes after the fact to, a nurse stopped me and said this and it took 10 seconds, or how is this actually being recorded?
Yes to all of the above. And sometimes there were video recordings, sometimes there were not. Sometimes there's granularity to the level of the nurse, while the hospital wouldn't let the standby team do anything to the patient after deanimation, one of the nurses cooperated and did 5 or 10 minutes of CPR, of chest compressions, and gave heparin. So different cases have different details and different ways of recording those details. But I think the most common is the report being written and reviewed by the people who were there.
So is a lot of the way that a lot of this data that was sitting in, filing cabinets or such, is it a lot of just handwritten notes of people saying, here are some, here are things that I think were relevant to this case, and then, a few pages of random stuff, and you have to figure out how to put that into, how to give that structure and
Yep, that's exactly right.
So
Quite a tedious task.
Yeah, I can imagine. So is one of the things that maybe more recently was being done is creating some kind of paperwork to be able to record these things better than they have been recorded in the past. So yes, instead of just free writing notes where you're going to forget important details, or you're going to write things that aren't really relevant, or you're going to just waste time, having a sheet that says, did this occur? Yes, no, or, to some extent, or whatever.
Have those. They've always had those.
Okay.
And it's just a question of, sometimes it's handwriting. You just can't read the handwriting. Sometimes the copies are bad. Sometimes not everything was checked off. And it really comes down to these reports. And I do have to say, I've looked at the data up until 2020, up through 2020. And I have been looking at the more recent reports, 21 to present. And I do think there has been a great improvement over the last few years in the quality of the written reports and the incorporation of the data that's available. So you have a team of people sort of writing up these reports and looking at all the data and putting the data as much as they can into the reports and clarifying it. So I think we're in much better shape now than we have been in the past in terms of the quality of the reports and the data being reported.
Now this is just speculation, but how possible do you think, I know the technology will be there in a year or two for just having a video recording being analyzed by an AI, and just taking like just very dutiful notes about everything going on, and printing perfect transcripts, because right now for text they can do that pretty well. They're working on pictures, and for videos soon that will be pretty capable as well. Any idea if that would even be an option, or would there be some barrier to that?
So most of the video taking is done in the Alcor operating room. So, hospitals and hospices, they're not going to allow video in their facilities for the most part. And so I don't think we're going to have that video aspect anytime soon in the beginnings, in the stages where you're in another external facility. Can you set up video things in the rescue vehicles? I think that depends on a number of factors. Are teams traveling to get to a patient, and are they renting vehicles? In that case, setting up a camera might take some extra time. If you have enough people, great. There's all kinds of difficulties here. These cases are really complex, and the more complexity you add, like setting up a video camera, takes more time away. So, there really has to be a balance between doing what's important at the moment for the patient and what's going to help us in the future in terms of analysis. Now, going back to old reports, many of the reports, not all, but many of the reports, and again, it depends on who wrote them, are written somewhat anecdotally. And there's, this one was thinking this at the time about what this one said to them, and all this sort of gossipy sort of things going on at the same time in these reports. So I'm not sure, and I don't know, how well the current AIs are at pulling, important information out of things like these at this point. I would imagine we're not there yet. So looking at some of the older reports still might be difficult for an AI system until, the closer we get to a generalized AI, the more likely that's going to be, but that has other implications.
Yeah, maybe GPT 6 or 7 or 8 or whatever, by then to be just fine on this front. Maybe on other fronts it'd be interesting times.
Yeah,
I
but
want to give a
I wouldn't throw anything like any non-public things into a chat GPT, since we don't seem to quite own the data that goes in there anymore.
yeah, yeah. Although I guess is all this information, just a random question, but is all this information that is kept in these file drawers and all this? I mean, I know Alcor has its own privacy policies and procedures and all this, but is it protected by HIPAA or anything like that?
So by default we apply HIPAA to it. But what I would say is, when you sign up for Alcor, you have a choice if you want your case public or private. But you're generally, from what I've seen, not going to have a conversation about every medical detail. How do you decide what to put out there and what not to put out there? And Alcor has put a lot of detailed information out there. I think more recently they've erred more on the side of caution. So I think even if a patient has said you can make my case public, I think they're leaning towards sharing less information publicly than they used to.
I want to give folks a flavor of the types of information that you guys that Alcor and that you were trying to put into a database, trying to collect, trying to look at. So some of it are whether or not there was an autopsy, was there an unintended death incident, SST deployment and cardiopulmonary support. I suppose how much of that was administered. What were the issues around the hospice or hospital logistics? Was hypothermia induced? I suppose when and how, etc. Which medications were administered? And at what points, etc. Remote blood substitution. I'm not sure what do you mean by that, but cryoprotection, field cryoprotection, right? So was that done? Monitoring of SST and cryoprotection, and then a whole bunch of stuff around the S-mix. Were there any major factors that you wish had been kept track of over the years, and that you could put into a database, but hadn't been, and now those are some big factors that you hope are going to be reported going forward?
I think the most important thing is temperature data. There's a lot of cases where temperature data was either not taken during the entire process, or data loggers stopped working, or all kinds of any problem you can imagine going wrong with taking temperature. Where was the temperature taken? How far was the device inserted? Was the head cooling faster than the rest of the body? There's all these data points to take into account, all of these factors. And the main thing we're concerned with is the brain, and is preserving the brain as well as possible. But it takes a certain amount of time for the brain to cool before, say, your nasopharyngeal area cools. So there's all these there's a lot of, I think, extrapolation in terms of how well cryopreservation is being done based on temperature data.
And on the subject of temperature data, you mentioned a couple of different ways to read temperature data. What would you say is the gold standard for sensors and collection of temperature data? So if under perfect circumstances, under complete lab controlled conditions, which probes, which sensors are where in the person's body, and how are they tracking that?
By default, if I had every temperature probe available and I was going to use it in calculating the S-mix, I would use the nasopharyngeal. Again, because of the importance of the brain and preserving the brain properly. And
so you think with that one, you don't need very many others?
I wouldn't say I don't need them, but I would say that, if I had to make a choice of which one to have, it would be the nasopharyngeal.
Got it. So there's a lot of factors in this, and of course now we should probably talk about the one that is related to this temperature issue and to cool down, etc., as you've been describing, and we've been avoiding it, but we're now going to jump into it. Tell us what is an SMIC score? Why does this score matter?
Okay, so the SMIC, let me just bring something up real quick. So SMIC stands for the Standardized Measure of Ischemic Exposure. And what this measures is how much ischemic exposure in units of time was experienced by the patient during the cryopreservation process. So it's measuring how much damage was done to the patient ischemically during the process. And the calculation, the most important part of that calculation is temperature data. So what we're doing is we're taking time periods or procedure periods during the cryopreservation. So for example, how quickly did the body cool between when the patient deanimated and when CPR was completed? Was there oxygenation with the CPR? Was there was the patient cooled in an ice bath? So the question is how between the beginning of CPR or the beginning of deanimation of the patient and the end of CPR, what was done, and temperature and time being the most important factors to calculate this SMIC score.
And and I'm digging into a couple of those things. But when you say was CPR being done, or was how was the patient? Was somebody attempting to provide oxygen to this patient, even though they weren't doing that by themselves? Do you measure the quality of that, of somebody doing that? So somebody sitting there doing chest compressions and breathing into a person is one thing, but if they're on the equivalent of like a ventilator, right, that would be a higher quality version of that. Do you distinguish between those two in the SMICs?
For the SMICs right now, it's not distinguished. As long as somebody's doing some sort of chest compressions, whether it's a human or a machine doing it, we count that. It's the same. Generally when there's a human doing it, if there's enough people to keep switching off, because we get tired, right? You have a longer period of chest compressions than you do, and than you would normally with only one or two people there. With the machine, obviously, you have longer periods. But that, whether it's 5 minutes or 20 minutes, that's counted the same no matter how it's being done.
Got it. So I had I heard a presentation on the SMICs before, and I've heard it described and discussed, and I've talked about it to some people, and I was making the argument, and now you can tell me, Mike, that I was completely wrong, but I was making the argument that the SMIC score is not an overall score of ischemic damage. It is simply a measure of ischemic exposure, but not necessarily damage. Because there may be other mitigating factors in how much actual damage the cells, were being, how much damage was being done to the cells in this way, rather than simply the amount of time they were exposed to this damage. So there may be certain medications, for example, that were administered that could lessen the amount of damage that the cells were receiving due to this lack of oxygen. Am I wrong in making this argument? Would you say that this should be considered a measure of the actual damage, or what's the nuance here?
So it's the answer is somewhere in between. The way again, we're focused on the brain really. So the way to check that, and they do this, is to do CT scans of the brain after the cryopreservation has been completed. So that's one of the things we're looking at. We're comparing the SMICs results to the CT scan results to see how much preservation was done. You can't really measure in every part of the body what exactly type of damage has been done. So in that sense, you're right. Uh, in terms of just going by ischemic exposure, that is generally what this is looking at. But we can bring the two together using other methods like the CT scan to see, compare the S-mix to the CT scan results to see how well an S-mix can predict actual ischemic damage.
Uh, uh, well, two things. First, just so listeners and viewers understand, it's correct. The lower the S-mix score, the better, right? Okay, so just to get that clear. And then I was interested when you said the kind of correlating the CT scans and the S-mix. So for starters, what exactly are CT scans measuring?
They're measuring how much water versus cryopreservation material is in the brain.
Okay. And so if you're trying to correlate these two, I guess how many patients have actually, or Alcor patients have actually had CT scans?
Yeah, so they've been doing the head CT scan since 2011. So in most cases, most neuro cases since 2011 have had CT scans.
And that happens immediately after the preservation?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so
generally before they're put in the doer, yeah.
Okay, and so it's been neuro specifically. Are there plans to do that with previous patients who are already in the doers?
I don't. They're not. My understanding is that they're not planning on doing that specifically because of the effort that would take. I'm thinking that there has been maybe one or two, maybe other cases where they were taking the patient out for some other reason and they did a CAT scan. Yeah, I don't remember what cases those were.
Yeah,
I don't think they're specifically planning on doing that right now.
Yeah, I imagine that would kind of, the logistics of that might cause issues around, well, for starters, damaging the patient, and how exactly
taking the patient out.
Yeah. And then I think there would probably be some issues. I'm curious your thoughts on this with informed consent. I would have to relook at the contract, but I don't know. Is it in the patient's best interest to actually be scanned at this current moment? Maybe at some point in the future, when they're ready to be revived, or they need some information so that they can better, do the revival process. But how would that help them?
I think that sort of thing is left up to Alcor to decide. I don't think there's anything in the contract that says, that sort of micromanages any of that. It basically says if Alcor thinks that XYZ is going to improve your chances of reanimation, Alcor is free to do that.
So I want to push a little more on this question of whether the S-mix is really able to determine, or how well is it correlated with the amount of damage done to the patient's brain from ischemic damage. Would there be so when you've had the chance to look over all these CAT scans, and what would you say is the correlation? Have you already been able to determine what the correlation is between the S-mix and the quality of the CT scans?
No, we're in the process of doing that now, but the short version is the more ice you see in the CAT scan, the worse it is.
And then how closely is that, do you think, in any given case, how closely is that related to the S-mix?
I think in the extreme cases, I think, there's not a perfect correlation, I don't think, in any of the cases. Some are more obvious than others, like the more extreme cases, but we're in the process of reviewing all that now. So I don't have a definitive answer for you yet.
I guess would theoretically like something like a straight freeze that was done very fast have a higher S mix?
That would be 100% ice. Yeah.
Yeah. So
I
it's
mean, but it's
oh,
also going to be there's also going to be an impact. Generally, in a straight freeze case, almost all the time, there's a long period before any procedures in terms of standby. Well, there was no standby, but any procedure in terms of stabilization were done. So that automatically is going to create a high S mix.
Have you also used the S-mix score on non-human animals? Have you tried
No,
to look
not
at?
yet. No.
Okay. That could just show you, so there might be a whole bunch more data that you can then use to make that
Right.
correlation. I mean, it might be easier to do, CT
Yeah,
scans on
I'm not
cats and
sure
dogs.
how much data there is on that, in order to do a good enough study on that.
Because historically you're not gonna, if you have little data on human temperatures, you're gonna have even less data on
Right. Yeah.
yeah.
And we're already talking, not huge amount, I mean, large amount of data, but not a huge number of patients.
Yeah. What other factors besides a CT scan do you think would be useful in being able to say, if we know the S mix and we know, if we know the S mix plus this plus this plus this, then we will, 99% correlation with the actual amount of damage that was ischemic damage.
I don't think we're there yet. I think that's an area that has to be studied. One of the purposes of the meta-analysis and coming up with this S mix was to further determine what research needs to be done to answer questions like you're asking. So the purpose of the meta-analysis is not to answer all these questions. We can answer some of them, and we can do the steps towards answering those questions. But one of the main purposes of this analysis and collecting all this data is to open up new questions and the ability for other researchers to look at all this data in one place and ask these questions and do more research.
And can you tell us a little bit about what you've found so far when it comes to these S-mix scores and how they have been changing historically?
I think the most surprising thing that most people seem to be surprised at is, so mind you, these cases are from the beginning. Some of them include James Bedford, some of them don't. So from 1967 to 2020. And the trend as to whether or not cryopreservation has improved largely seems to be flat. I mean, there's actually a slight downward curve. But for the most part, it seems to be flat in terms of any improvement in cryopreservation. So, that was one of the most shocking findings here.
So can I interrupt real quick? When you say any improvement in cryopreservation or any improvement in specifically the S-mix score?
Any improvement in cryopreservation itself.
Okay.
And the results in the patients based on the S-mix score.
Based on the S-mix score. Yeah.
Right, based on the S-mix score. So the S-mix scores over time actually show a slight increase. So an increase is bad in time. So it's taking longer to do the preservations.
So
again, it's only a slight curve upwards, and I think for all intents and purposes, it's flat. So it's taking about the same time as it did 40, 50 years ago overall to do a case.
So I remember at the Tomorrow Biostasis conference, you had mentioned this, and I feel like myself and others were a little bit shocked by hearing this. And because the assumption, for everybody would be that, over time things get better, especially in a field that revolves around technology. And to hear you say that it was, flat and even going down to some small degree, that felt like a gut punch a little bit. But kind of thinking back on it, is it fair that you're using S-mix in a vacuum to make that determination? Is it, if you add in, all the other variables, is it actually getting worse, or is it S mix that's causing that perception?
So that's the question, right? And I don't think we have the answer to that. I think that once more analysis is done on all these other factors to determine how we think a case went, I do think there's going to be some improvement in cases. But if I use one other factor as, let's say I make it as important as the S mix, and that's the quality of data, the quality of reports over time, I do see the same up and down. If you look at a graph of the S mix scores over that time period, and if I were to make a graph of the quality of reports and data available in a similar fashion, I think you would see the same ups and downs that you see in the S mix score as you do in the quality of data. Now, you could argue that that's because the data is bad. That's why the S mix looks the way it is. But we don't know that. We don't have an answer to that question. Now, if you ask that question from a mathematical perspective, I'm not sure I'm the right person to ask that. This might be a Mike Perry or an Ashwin de Wolf question, who came up, developed this. Given my experience in mathematics, it's not a perfect thing. It's not going to be a perfect correlation to everything, but I do think in terms of a general trend, we're going to see, some variations up or down, but I think we're in the ballpark. And, when I say that I'm using the quality of case reports, I also correlate in my mind, at least, if the case report's bad, the quality of care might have been bad. So I'm seeing, without sitting down and doing a detailed analysis of each of these pieces yet, I am seeing a correlation on a macro level with all these things.
I refuse to believe it. I'm having willful ignorance right here.
Well, I think it's...
Well, look,
yeah.
Technology is tools, right? And if you have somebody who is not using the tools properly, it doesn't matter what the technology is, unless you're going into the general AI discussion, which you could also argue against that because it was developed by people to begin with. So the quality of the tools may help, but it's not going to solve the problem.
I'm in Daniel's camp. I'm still trying to push against this, right?
Yeah.
But for example, the mix of medications that are administered to a patient as they're initiating cool down and all that, that has changed over time, and presumably it's gotten better over time. And that's potentially one mitigating factor that would suggest that things aren't as bad as they seem. Maybe if there's a handful of other mitigating factors like that. Obviously, the cryoprotectant has gotten better since the development. I think it was in early 2000s or such of M22 or whatever it was. So could there if there's a list of a few of these mitigating factors, then presumably the actual end result cryopreservation could be getting better, even if the S mix scores are flat.
So one of the areas, let me just step back a minute. One of the areas that I specialized in when I was an engineer at Lockheed was process improvement. When I worked in space systems, we had top of the line technologies, top of the line, anything you can imagine technology wise. But if the humans didn't get it right, if the humans didn't understand it right, if they didn't do the procedures right, if they didn't catch something, the entire satellite could come down. My job in this period was to do sort of Six Sigma process improvement type events. And I see the same thing here. I see the same thing, the same problem here. Whereas, the procedures, which Ashwin wrote many of them, might look great on paper, but how they are implemented, again, that has gone up and down over time. And I think that is really, really important, more important than most people realize, to get these processes in place and done in a proper way, the way it's written is close to theoretical as humanly possible. Now, there's a lot of mitigating factors. For example, if you can get into a hospital and do a standby, there's still things like that. But I think there are ways to mitigate most of these things. It's a really, really, really complex problem, how to get these procedures done properly. This is not something, it's not something we're talking about. You can't just say, well, somebody screwed up, so they screwed up the whole case. It's not that simple. And until you've looked at all of the data and all the procedures and how they're implemented, sure, there's lots of places where you could say this got screwed up or that got screwed up, or we just don't know because the information is not there. Why is the information not there? But there's so many mitigating factors that it's really hard to say, what the cause is. That's why we're collecting so much data. And this really, again, is going to take a long time to really dig into to understand what factors are causing what. While it's on the surface, it may seem shocking that there hasn't been a great deal of improvement, but looking at it from the perspective of, I'll call it operator error, I'm not surprised.
I feel like, oh, go ahead, Daniel.
Well, I could say you said if the tools are not being used right, and you just mentioned
or they just
error,
fail, or data loggers fail.
Yeah. Well, can you give us an example of what you think kind of, or one or two examples of what exactly is failing? I can off the top of my head, like the temperature gauge and any kind of random malfunctions of a tool. But are there specific ones that are particularly egregious in terms of failure rates or not being useful over time?
I can't, again, I can't, temperature is important. Knowing what the temperature changes are is important. Now, why are we missing data? Data loggers fail. I see that all the time. The data is just missing. It's not in the file, not in the folder. There's in the reports that I've been looking at, you have a lot of extremes of good quality and bad quality. And again, the only way I can look at this is to extrapolate and say, on some level, the bad quality reports more often than not might mean it might have been a bad case. Or, it also could just mean stuff wasn't recorded properly. They were too engrossed in what they were doing to record anything. But there's really no way to tell. And going back to, the thing that both of you guys were talking about, you in particular, Max, how well do we correlate actual ischemic damage to the S-mix? I think while studying that those results are going to take into account these human factors, and that human factor data is going to help us understand that same thing as well. But I'll give an example in the space business where I came across one particular situation where, the satellite just kept failing. And nobody could understand why the satellite just kept failing, and they had trouble getting it back operating properly. It was a lack of, you had multiple teams working on these systems. And it was a lack of understanding of who was responsible for what. Who was responsible for this part of the system? Who was responsible for this procedure? And once this process improvement was done and the mitigations were applied, we went from 3 to 4 midnight call-ins a week to 0. 0. That's how important I think improving the implementation of procedures and processes is. And I see the same thing here in cryonics.
So, but just for my own clarification, the S-mix score takes into account the amount of time during which someone was at a given temperature above freezing, right? It doesn't.
Right.
Once
Correct.
you're below freezing,
Right.
that's not really relevant.
That's it. Yep.
Of course, somebody could be at 2 degrees below freezing for a week, and
Right.
that's not good. That's
Right. That's a different problem.
yeah. But it does affect the overall quality of the cryopreservation
Sure.
at the end of the day.
Yep.
So that just might be one way in which the correlation is not going to be perfect between
Right.
exposure and damage, or the S mix and actual damage.
Yep.
So given that,
Well, it's like somebody being at dry ice temperatures versus liquid nitrogen temperatures. There's going to be more damage at dry ice temperatures than at liquid nitrogen temperatures.
Yep. So I guess there's two in my head still remaining non-trivial objections to the S mix as a useful metric. One of which I think you'll mostly agree with, and one of which I think you'll mostly disagree with. But the one that I think you'll mostly agree with then is that what we would really want is some kind of overall absolute, here is the cryopreservation quality index, and then one of the factors it takes into account might be the S mix score. Another one might be, for example, some kind of S mix like score that factors in time between 0 degrees Celsius down to liquid nitrogen temperatures, and then manages to do that. And then it might also take into account other things, whether the if somebody was poking around during the procedure and did something else that might have caused damage to the brain, or didn't administer the right medications at the right time, or whatever the case was. So I feel like there could be multiple other scores that could be factored into some overall thing. When do you feel like, do you think there's like a lot of analysis
or even factor these other things into the S mix score somehow?
But then it wouldn't be an S mix, right? It would be a something other, rename it or something, right?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what you're throwing in there.
Yeah. So I feel like that one you're mostly on board with, right? That the more we can throw in there that's relevant, and then overall come out to some really good index. But I think the other objection that you might not agree with would be that the S mix score is something like, it's kind of the streetlight problem. So because we don't have access to all these other potential sources of information as to the overall quality of cryopreservation, the only one that we've managed to design in a quantifiable way is the S mix. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think anybody else has tried to come up with a score that's at all correlated with actual end result damage. But because this is the only one we have, we are so focused on this that we're losing focus on all the other things that could potentially be relevant to the overall cryopreservation, right? And so streetlight problem, right? That we're looking for the answer where the light is. We're looking for the answer here at the S mix just because this is all we've got, and it's a bad idea to be so focused on the S mix. But it's an objection. But what do you think about that?
Shockingly, I agree with you. I don't disagree.
Okay.
I think there are some people that have that spotlight problem. It depends on who you hear talk about it. And that's why I keep reinforcing that there's still other work that needs to be done, whether it's correlating with the CT scan or correlating with the other data. We're not there with some perfect overall thing yet. What I am saying is that I do think that the S mix is still representing some general trend. I think you're going to see variations in whether that trend goes up or down. I don't think you're going to see any exponential differences in the trend we're seeing in the S mix and any trends we're going to see with other data. Could there be one point of something that's shockingly different? Sure. You're going to have that with anything. But, I think, for an initial shot at this, I think we're in a general ballpark of trending, of what the trending looks like. And again, it doesn't surprise me based on what I've seen in quality reports and human error, etc. Without that, I might have backed off and said, okay, maybe you're completely right, and maybe this is useless. But based on what I've seen in terms of quality of execution of procedures, quality of reports, and my background in process improvement, I'm not surprised. And I think that this SMIC score does have some accuracy in terms of the trending.
And so, in terms of some of the takeaways of why the SMIC score is the way it is, you in your one of your talks you discussed a few large factors. One of the biggest ones being unattended death. How much does that factor? And I think I remember you said something like 70% of the top 10 SMIC scores were unattended deaths. So how much overall are these unattended deaths specifically contributing to these kind of downward SMIC scores?
So if you remember from the talk, I ended up one of the trend lines I did was without them. And it did improve slightly, but not significantly enough to say, oh, that was the cause of the whole problem.
Okay.
Not even close.
Okay, so that's good to know.
Yeah.
I do actually want to get into those more because separately they were also kind of one of the most interesting takeaways I thought. So first, just to define things, I understand what unattended death implies, but attended death, does that mean specifically an SST team there, or could it be a family member just doing CPR or a nurse at a hospital? What defines attended?
The person is not alone.
Okay.
Or the person is not, a hospital just didn't. The person not. So the person could be in the hospital and deanimate, and they just don't even throw them in a cooler, right? Not that that happens very often, but it can happen for 2-3 hours. But for the most part, unattended is those rare cases, or there's nobody there to, call somebody and say, start some kind of stabilization process.
Yeah, it could be that a person dies next to their spouse.
At night.
Early in the night, yeah, and
Right,
just
yep.
that the spouse doesn't even realize
Yep,
it. So
exactly. Yep.
Yeah.
That's for our purposes unattended.
Okay, and then for those unattended, what percentage of those were straight freezes? Ended up being straight freezes versus being vitrified?
I'd have to look up those stats. Give me a second. I would say most of them were straight freezes, but I don't know if I have that handy off the top of my head.
That's okay. I guess more pertinent question would be kind of, well, first, under what conditions were the straight freezes happening generally?
Unattended death generally.
Okay, so
unattended death and postmortem third party.
Okay, and you had said about 50% of people were home alone for these unattended deaths. And so I have some. I guess I'm not particularly surprised by that, but it does bring up some interesting issues of a lot of cryonicists being single and without spouses, and without children, or at least children that they live with. Do you have any kind of specific thoughts on that? I guess. Generally speaking, everybody would probably agree it's a bad idea, but I'm curious if there was any data that was interesting on that front.
Yeah, so let me go back to the straight freeze question real quick. I've got a slide here that shows that of unattended deaths, 54% of those were straight freezes.
Okay.
So in terms of your last question, so repeat the question.
Sorry. Yeah. So quickly. So 50%, about 50% were unattended, were straight freeze. So members should know that if you end up unattended, there's
so mitigating that, right? So mitigating, the people who live alone.
Yeah.
So Alcor has people like Ben Best and Nikki, I can't think of her last name right now.
Nikki Olson.
Yeah, have been looking at technologies to help mitigate that. Things like the Apple Watch may be one way, but Alcor has implemented a service. I think that costs extra to check on people at least once a day to make sure they're okay. So that's one of the things that we're looking at is, how do you mitigate an unintended death?
Yeah.
We're looking at that a little bit, but I think that's something that needs to be studied and is being studied by some people.
Yeah. I think that's, Alcor's program, I think it's a good start, but
right.
I guess there's a pretty high likelihood, depending on, when that call gets to you.
Right.
And theoretically, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I mitigate by using Alcor service, and I also have an app on my phone that if I don't press a button by a certain time, so I spread them between, throughout half the day.
Okay. Yeah, I know.
But I also have the Apple Watch, right, which, it doesn't alert if your heart stops, but alerts if you fall over.
Yeah.
And sends out an emergency message. So there's all these things like this that you can do.
Yeah, I know. We had Nikki on the podcast not too long ago, and she has a lot to say about these sensors.
Right.
And quickly, I'm going to plug her website, cryonicsmonitoring.org. So she's compared all the different cryonics monitoring devices that are currently out there, and I think if people are interested in this topic, that'd be a good place to kind of get an overview of the pros and cons of each of them and kind of what needs to happen to actually make that a thing. But yeah, so given that so many people are dying alone home, I think this is something that needs to actually get addressed sooner than later.
Yeah.
Moving on to another, which I would say might have been even more shocking than kind of some of the SMIC scores, was suicide. So something like 40% of the unattended deaths were suicides.
Yep.
Now, that's just so strange to me. I would not have expected that at all. Given that, someone signed up for cryonics has to be aware that they have a specific goal in mind to get their body to these cryo orgs. And something has to have gone really wrong in their lives to obviously to be in such a bad place where they want to commit suicide in the first place, but also not to have either the faculties or the willpower or any number of contributing factors to actually figure out if that would get them a good or bad cryopreservation. So quickly, what are some of the findings, the overall general findings on the members that did commit suicide and kind of how that affected their cryopreservations?
What do you mean findings in terms of what?
I guess my assumption is they got very bad cryopreservations,
right?
Because of the suicide. Let me see. I have a small picture of one of your graphs here, or one of your charts. Excuse me. Okay, so yeah, some of the kind of highest SMIC scores. So the worst outcomes were suicide. Like one of them. Well, I guess for one, could you tell us anything about the general demographics of people who are committing suicide? Younger, older, male, female? I guess anything you can let us know?
We have one case, a gentleman in his 80s, and one case, somebody in his 20s. So, I think you're going to see the similar demographics than you would the general population. It was interesting. I was listening to your podcast with Emil. And you were talking about, I think Max, you brought this up, about there seems to be this algorithm that as you get older, you just don't care about living longer anymore.
Yeah.
And, perhaps the suicide thing is a malfunction of that same algorithm.
Yeah. Whatever system keeps us going seems to degrade just like everything else is degrading.
Yeah. Or some shock to the system, kicks in that algorithm.
And is it true that the suicides also increase the risk of autopsy?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. It's a requirement in most places.
Oh wow. Okay. So yeah, I almost want to kind of.
Even unattended deaths, it's a requirement to do an autopsy.
Oh, okay. So these are some of the. So just a general unattended death, they're required to do an autopsy. Even if they're reading the bracelet and calling Alcor. What about being unattended specifically kind of triggers these autopsies?
Because nobody was there to see the death, and they don't know if somebody was in the house or wherever and killed the person somehow in some difficult to detect way or what have you. Alcor does do a lot of work in terms of trying to mitigate autopsies in these types of cases, whether it's minimizing the autopsy, not slicing up the brain, just doing a CAT scan. It depends on the case. And there seems to be, it depends on the medical examiner, it depends on a lot of different factors as to whether or not they're able to mitigate an autopsy or not. One of the rules is preserve the brain, preserve the brain, preserve the brain. So the thing that they're generally most interested in is not having the brain sliced up. But even when that does happen, I think, and it depends on when the contract was written, some of the contracts say, even if that happens, preserve whatever brain material you have. But Alcor does, they bring in the lawyers, they get involved in the courts right away as quick as they can. They do a lot to try to mitigate autopsies.
Yeah. I want to ask a question here on the issue of suicide. Do you know if these suicide cases did they count people who were home alone or in a hospital, were in pain and just kept pressing the morphine button too many times then, or are these real, the person just couldn't stand it anymore and took a shotgun and, did they different?
Yep.
Yeah. The latter. So more, real suicides, in other words,
Yes,
not accidental.
Right.
I pressed the morphine
or not,
button. Okay.
Sneakily, I guess you want to call it.
Okay. And not to be morbid, but Max, that actually what prompts me to think, like, does the data show how they committed suicide? That I guess that would give.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And is there anything? I actually don't know the general statistics on suicide and how most people do it, but what are I'm only asking to try to find kind of to try to put myself in the mind of a cryonicist who's doing this. Are they doing this with some thought as to how it will affect their cryopreservation, or it seems like they're.
I don't think so. I don't think there's any concern about that.
Okay, so at this point, when they're committing suicide, this is cryonics is not even in their mind probably at this point. I mean, are any of them calling Alcor beforehand or?
Yeah. There was, there's not that many cases here, so I'm careful to discuss details because you might be able to, pick out who this might have been. But there's cases where one individual spent months talking to people at Alcor, and they tried to talk this individual out of it and give all the reasons why this person shouldn't do it, and ended up happening anyway. And then there's cases, like you said, where somebody just picks up the gun and that's the end. So, it's all over the place.
Yeah. I mean, the only thing I can take between the unattended deaths and suicides, it seems to some extent loneliness is one huge factor in a good cryopreservation for a good portion of these, because both the unattended part and the suicide, are probably loneliness is a huge factor.
It's hard to know. I mean, why somebody commits suicide. Is it an organic problem in the brain? Is it, it's hard to tell.
Yeah. Sorry, I've depressed myself with this conversation. And then I guess the last 10% of that is 50 unattended or 50 home alone, 40% suicide, and 10% during sleep. I don't know if there's anything interesting to discuss with people dying in their sleep. It's kind of the same issue with needing proper monitoring. I guess uh, what would you recommend, knowing what you know now, to not just Alcor but any CSOs? What should they be doing differently, and why?
You know, that's a difficult question to answer because each organization has, you know, in some cases, very different procedures and very different services they offer or level of service that they offer. Um, for a place like Alcor, and I suspect tomorrow Biostasis, really mitigate that human factor issues, whether it's procedures being done properly and thoroughly, or interaction with hospitals, or having connections with doctors who are friendly to cryonics in any particular area. Just to bring up biostasis technologies real quick, because I think it's pertinent here. The idea behind BT is to create a standards organization to create standards for SST, standby stabilization and transport. But the other idea is to have local organizations do cases only in their areas. And by doing that, they're creating relationships with local hospitals, local doctors, local medical examiners. So this is sort of one of the attempts to, to mitigate the things that we're talking about by having a local organizations with all these connections to smooth that entire process by having all the connections in place on top of doing the procedures right and thoroughly.
Now, you had mentioned biostasis technologies, and I want to get into that, but before we do, Max, did you have any further thoughts?
I was wondering. I know that the database and the SMIC scores that you've put together for all these cases were obviously just Alcor's data, but is there any chance that CI would be willing to share any of their data or their historical findings or such? It might just be useful to have more, to look at and to more data points to understand better what actually is going right or wrong.
Yeah, with CI, I don't know. I haven't been involved in any discussions, even if there has been any. Ashwin would be more the person to ask that question. I know there have been discussions with Tomorrow Biostasis along those lines, but I'm not familiar with the outcomes yet.
Yeah. Hopefully tomorrow hopefully there can be at least one database encompassing as much of the data as possible, and tomorrow Biostasis has the benefit of.
I imagine they would.
Yeah. Hopefully CI also decides to partake in that. That would be very helpful for the whole industry. Mm-hmm. It could either be some kind of where all the different cryo organizations are cooperating, or it could be some third party, maybe something like a Biostasis Technologies that helps coordinate this mechanism to put these things together.
Right. Yeah.
Are you still fully involved and engaged in putting this together, or are there other individuals within Biostasis Technologies or outside of it, or is there anybody else involved in this?
Putting what together?
Putting the database together, doing the meta-analysis.
So that's pretty much been my purview more than anybody else. And obviously Ashwin has quite a bit of input to that.
Okay. And you're still the one doing this going forward as well?
Yep.
Got it. Yeah. So, Daniel, if you want to jump into BT.
Okay. So I want to talk a decent amount about this new organization, Biostasis Technologies. It's the new kid on the block. So first, what exactly is it? Who's working on it? Who started it? And then I have a few more follow-ups on there.
So, there's a bunch of people involved. I'm trying to decide where to start. I think I don't know much of the history of all the other organizations. In terms of that history, Ashwin or somebody else would be, better equipped than I am to go through that. But, obviously Ashwin was a big proponent of this. People like Ben Best and Houston Westerfall and, a handful of other people. Carrie Radomski is on the board of BT. The idea was, especially after seeing, this sort of lack of improvement, just to go back to that a second, I think the people that have been directly involved for a long time were not entirely surprised by this result. I mean, it's still a shocking result, no matter who's looking at it, in terms of how, whether there's been improvement. But I think as people thought about it, particularly the people that have been involved for quite some time, they can look at it and say, you know what, here's where I think the holes were that caused this problem based on my experience, doing this. And I think that's the group of people who has come together to put together biostasis technologies. And the idea is not to just try to reinvent the wheel and just create another SST organization, which that's there's another organization that's doing that. But to create an organization that creates standards across the industry, that whatever organization comes up can look at, and say, okay, this was researched, this was studied, and these are the results they came up with in terms of whether it's equipment to use, quality of equipment, procedures to do, and that's sort of the idea behind biostasis technologies, is to create these standards for people to follow. And again, like I said earlier, that's part of the problem. Then you've got to have the people, implementing it properly, and that's where training comes in. And BT intends to do this training as well for SST organizations as they come up.
Okay, so
that's the other big piece of it.
So you're going to be both doing this work in SST alongside being kind of an open source hub to some extent. I don't know if that's a fair analogy.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to look at it. It's sort of it's like an IEEE of cryonics, right? Where you're setting standards for certain things. But at the same time, and look, an organization like IEEE does trainings as well, right? So it's sort of modeled after these other organizations that create standards for different industries.
And are you gonna do sort of certification too, and
Yeah, that's training and potential certifications, and that's all being formed now. What those plans are.
And who's funding the project or the company?
BRLS. I can never remember what that stands for.
Okay, so that's
they're our main source of funding right now.
So I believe that's Bill Falloon,
right?
With Ben Best is part of that as well. Okay, and what would you say some of the major projects you're working on at the moment in biostasis technologies?
So I have a list of that. Give me 1 second to pull that up. I just have it open here. So there's about 7 or 8 things that we're looking at right now. Liquid ventilation, Charles Platt has been looking at that. We're looking at different dry shippers for brain-only cases, how to, what dry shippers are the best. So we actually bought a dry shipper, and we're going to be shipping, some equivalent of a brain material, whether it's a piece of meat or what have you, ship it across country, keep temperature recording while it's being shipped, do all the studying of how good these particular dry shippers are. Comparing mechanical CPR devices, we have 2 right now that we've compared with the Lucas and the Core Pulse. evaluating it for how long it can operate, battery times, how difficult it is to operate. So we've been working on that. Air transportable perfusion circuits, where that's one of the things we plan on looking at. Training protocols, which I mentioned. Ice bath design, we now have 3 different versions of ice baths. The last 2 that Charles Platt has put together. We actually have those in our facility in Long Island City right now. 2 that Charles built and 1 in a rescue vehicle that we have. Overall rescue vehicle equipment fabrication and integration. We have sort of a vehicle that Alcor had given us that we're using as sort of a sandbox to put together the best equipment in the vehicle that we can, and maybe create a standard out of that. We're also looking at not just that vehicle, but looking at all other different vehicles like a Ford Transit or a Mercedes Sprinter. How do we look at different vehicles like that and build rescue vehicles from those? Also plan on looking at whole body field cryoprotection protocols. Ash would be probably the main person to talk to about that. But these are the types of things that BT is going to study and put some standards out there.
Okay. And how far are you along the road to being like fully up and running, or are you fully up and running?
So we really got started in October as an organization. Things were being done before that, but we had to get the facility, which we got in November, and we've been sort of gearing up the facility, combination of things, getting the facility ready to operate, getting the equipment to do some of this testing and doing some of this testing. So I think in terms of we're at the beginning in terms of starting to test equipment, and I think by the end of this, probably in the next 2 months, the facility will be up and running with everything set up to do all the things that we want to get done. And then I say by the end of the year, we'll probably have some results on some of the testing, and then start to write protocols and standards. We also have somebody working on training materials as we speak. So there's a bunch of things going on right now, but still mid-end of wrap-up stage.
Okay. And how long do you foresee until, I guess, maybe you're offering full-fledged SST services? It's a hard question.
So BT is not going to offer SST services.
Okay.
That's not the idea between BT. Resurgence Biomedical Sciences, which Houston Westfall is working on down in Florida, they're going to be an SST organization. And they're going to be local to the Florida market. And we're looking at getting one started up in New York as well. We don't know the incarnation of that yet, but it's going to be, whether it's connected to Resurgence Biomedical or going to be a separate entity, and who's going to do that. So we're putting all those pieces together now for an SST organization in New York as well.
And could I ask? I know Tomorrow Biostasis has had discussed a little bit about having some services eventually in New York and Florida. Are these at all connected, or is...
It's all connected? Yeah.
Okay. And I don't know if there's anything you can say at the moment about that relationship, or whether that's still.
I haven't been directly involved in all those discussions. That would be an optional question.
So the way you see that kind of rolling out, because we've had both Aaron Drake and Eric Vogt on the show, and both of them are fantastic. They know their stuff really well. Yep. So in the past, historically, right, SST has been as long as you're not actually in only miles away or whatever from the facility, it's been sending out ICE or SA to the patient's bedside. So do you foresee that in the future there will be maybe a handful of these very localized SST organizations in very specific markets, and then everybody else is still going to be served by something like ICE or SA?
Yeah, I think, well, that depends on where these organizations are, right? I don't know the answer to that question yet. I imagine, for the more rural areas, there's still going to be the need to go out and, travel to get to a case. Is there going to be an ICE or an SA that does that they're based in California or wherever, and they're going to run out to, the middle of Missouri to do a case? Or is there going to be an organization in St. Louis that can drive 2 or 3 hours to rural Missouri and do the case themselves? I think all that sort of thing is going to depend on where these local organizations are and how many resources do they have. Do the local organizations have enough vehicles in case there's a second case in the more local area versus the more distant area? I think it's going to be on a case-by-case basis. I think for the near future and maybe even the mid-future, there's still going to be some need for travel, by like ICE or whoever.
I feel like there's two major factors here. One is, of course, the proximity and how quickly these teams can potentially get to a patient and all this. But the other is that there are just so few cases in a given year that any team, if we had a team here in, say, Austin, Texas, we might, I don't know the numbers, of course, but even when you add up CI and Alcor, if we're going to get one case per year, and I guess if they're serving all of Texas, maybe a couple of cases in a year. So that, and maybe it's higher in New York or obviously in the Bay Area, or in South Florida or such, but it seems like there's just not enough. Like one of the biggest factors, you've done a lot of these kinds of understandings of what it really takes to get a team to be well honed and know their procedures and have their logistics ready and everything. And a lot of it is just practice, right? If one of these groups are doing a case once a year or a couple times a year or once every other year, that to me might be more dangerous than a team that would get there even an hour later or 2 hours later than that group. But they've at least done numerous cases in a given year, and they know what they're doing a lot better. So how do you think of these competing problems?
Yeah, this has been discussed more in the guise of Resurgence Biomedical, and Houston would be the person to talk to more about this. But all these topics have been discussed, and some mitigations have been discussed. The model of the business is of a SST organization itself. How do you sustain it? How do you sustain it when you have so few cases? And what you're mentioning makes that question even more challenging, right? Because it's just local cases. Just briefly, one of the ideas that Resurgence is working on is to not just have an SST organization, but to actually have a medical practice attached to the SST organization. And that serves a number of purposes. I can't talk much about it because I'm not directly involved in the details of it. But, there's that piece of it to keep the medical personnel trained in terms of medical training. And then there have also been discussions, and nothing set in stone yet, of sending people from one area to another area where there's a case to have them be involved. Now, they might not get there in the very beginning, or if there's a standby, they'll get there in the beginning, but sort of cross-train across locations. So that's been a discussion as well to try to mitigate that.
To have them sort of get there and shadow the people who are,
Yep. So they've been thinking about all these things.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of things might change in the next few years as these things roll out, hopefully for the best. So does biostasis technologies, everything you've described has to do with procedures, logistics, the science and technology of this, the medicine. Do they have any kind of outreach arm, or is that part of their mission?
Yeah, so as you know, we hired Max Moore to be our communications director. And they have a Substack out there that they've been writing articles about, and there's a monthly newsletter. I think the first one just came out in May. So, how we grow that, they're working on how to grow that and how to bring cryonics, or I'll call it biostasis, to the masses, so to speak. So that is one of the goals of that wing of things.
So when you say the goals, so is it to sort of increase the function as a sort of kind of a marketing arm of the cryonics industry as a whole, or is it just to better communicate with scientists and technologists in the field, or how would you describe that?
I would say that part of it is I don't know if I use the word marketing, but I guess that's what it is, right? Marketing to the masses, the idea of biostasis and cryonics, and bring more people into it, and the next generation.
I don't mean to be skeptical here. I'm just, isn't that two separate missions completely in terms of kind of marketing to the masses and what you're trying to do?
Well, that's why I was hesitant to use the word marketing, right? We're trying to be advocates for cryonics and biostasis. Advocate is probably a better word.
And are there any metrics that you guys are going to try and use to determine how well that's going? Because when you're in an organization like Tomorrow Biostasis, they can come up with a new plan. Hey, let's put out more YouTube content, and
Right.
then we're going to attract people that are in this particular demographic, and then they can track over time. They're getting people calling them up or sending them emails, and they say, "Hey, where did you first hear about us?" And they say, "Oh, these YouTube videos that you guys are producing,
Right.
and they're great." And that gives them some feedback as to whether or not what they're doing is useful. Do you guys have any sense of what mechanisms you might have for that kind of feedback and
they're
learning?
working that out now. Yeah, they're working that out now. Max has been on board since March, so they're working on all these things now.
Cool. I saw the Substack you guys have. Do you know is it a paid Substack? Like, are the articles?
So there's unpaid and paid.
Got it.
Yeah, you have a choice.
Are you gating any of the articles behind that paywall, or?
I'm not sure what they've done yet. I think they've played a little bit with that, but they're in the process of putting a plan together for that.
And would that be the place where people should be able to keep up to date with biostasis technologies as a company as well?
Yeah, on that Substack, the monthly newsletter comes out on that Substack.
Okay, we'll put a link.
The BT newsletter.
We'll put a link in the show notes.
Yep. So now we like to wrap up these conversations with an overrated or underrated segment, and we only a couple of quick overrated underrateds. So do you believe that the things we're going to mention are they overrated or underrated, or maybe appropriately rated, right? But
Okay.
you were talking about this earlier. So the first one is NASA's organizational culture, right? So people say that it's very bureaucratic, it's very slow, it doesn't learn well. It has a lot of these problems. Would you say that so NASA's organizational culture, is it overrated, underrated? Are things a lot better than people think they are, or what's your experience?
So I would say more in general in the space industry, whether it's NASA or commercial or other government space areas, I think there's been a great deal of improvement in the last 15 or so years. So I would think, from what I hear in the industry now, for at least the more government-related programs, I think things are rated as they should be. Commercial, I think a lot of it, not all of it, but a lot of it is still being run with a startup mentality. So yes, they're going to do all these great things, and commercial is the way to go, and commercial is going to be the future. And I agree with that, but I think aside from maybe, SpaceX and Blue Origin are obviously way ahead of most of the other smaller companies. So I think the majority of the industry, aside from those two, are probably a little bit overrated as to where they are. I think they all have the potential to get to where a SpaceX or a Blue Origin is. But, from what I've seen, I think that, embracing some of the stuff I talked about before in terms of procedure and process improvement and that sort of thing, as well as improvement on the technology, is going to be the key to their success. So I think commercially, the majority industry is a little bit overrated. SpaceX and Blue Origin, I think they are where they should be. And government I think they are rated as they should be.
So there's a lot of money chasing that SpaceX and Blue Origin kind of unicorn, and hoping that a lot of these other smaller players will morph into that.
Become these unicorns.
And just a follow-up on that question, personally speaking, what do you consider the most kind of exciting projects going on in the space industry generally?
The Artemis program.
What's that?
The moon program.
Could
landing people on the moon and creating colonies on the moon.
Ah, gotcha.
We're gonna do that long before we do that on Mars, I think.
Mm.
Which seems to me like a great idea. I mean, it's right there.
Yeah.
It's.
Yep. Yeah. I was just gonna say, just because of proximity.
Yeah.
And
seems like a great jumping off point to then be able to station, to use its for other projects, other space projects in the future, to other parts of the solar system.
NASA just awarded Blue Origin some of the landing contracts for some of the astronauts for the moon colony.
Mm. Well, while we're on that topic, what do you think of cryonics on the moon?
Well, cryonics for space travel in general, right? How do you travel to the Andromeda galaxy? I think we got a long way before we get there, just like we do here.
Yeah. I think we'll hopefully have perfect the technology in the best of circumstances here on Earth, and then consider its applications elsewhere.
So another overrated, underrated. You had mentioned your grandson has epilepsy to me. You had told me that, and you support a couple of epilepsy-related charities or organizations. So I guess I'd like to know a little bit more about that. But first, overrated or underrated kind of standard epileptic treatments versus, I guess, maybe any that are less mainstream.
I have not seen. There's always the standard stuff in medicine when it comes to the less mainstream. It's diet, it's exercise, it's this, that, and the other thing. I haven't seen anything with epilepsy as of yet in my travels and research in terms of anything outside the box, outside the normal medical industry box to treat it. I have seen lots of that with scleroderma and other autoimmune, but not as much with epilepsy. So I think any natural medicine or what have you, whatever you want to call it, For epilepsy, I would think anything that's out there is probably overrated.
Yeah, I had kept on hearing one thing in specific, and at this point I couldn't actually tell if it was mainstream or not. But
Keto diet?
yeah, ketosis
Yep.
specifically for epilepsy,
Right.
which, from what I understand, was a thing well before it became a kind of a fad diet for the general public. That it was specifically useful in epilepsy, although a very extreme version that a normal person would not fare well on.
Right. Which has its own problems.
Yeah.
That's why I still say overrated.
Okay.
I include the keto in that.
So the final overrated and underrated, and this can call upon a lot of the stuff we were talking about earlier in this discussion with the research that you've done into a lot of these cases. But overrated or underrated, relocating to be near to the CSO at the end of life.
Underrated. I think everybody should be doing that.
At what point? At what point?
It's underrated in the sense that people don't take that seriously enough.
Yeah, they're undervaluing it. At what stage should people be taking that? Just taking the, do it. Just bite the bullet, pack your bags, and get out there. Should they wait for a diagnosis of late stage cancer? Should they, if they early stage, how much risk should a person be? At what point should a person be taking that option very seriously?
I think, to me, if it was me, I think the key factor would be how difficult is travel. Can I hop on a plane and get to, say, Scottsdale with little to no difficulty? Whether I have 2 weeks to live or 2 months to live or what have you. I would, if it was me, I would like to be out there within a month or two of when I'm expected to deanimate. It's hard. I mean, there's a lot of factors in that as to what, whether people can afford that and what have you. How are the local organizations? I mean, that's changing over time and hopefully improving. Local SST organizations, we'll see where that goes. But I think as of now, get as close as you can, as soon as you can.
So if a person is still ambulatory and is feeling okay, but they have a 6-month diagnosis, and they're officially in hospice care, and they have some pain, but they're still able to move around, you would say that at that point, that's the optimal time. Do it now.
At least start thinking about it at that point. Don't let it get to the point where you're incapacitated. Probably, again, if it was me, if I started to become incapacitated, if I was on a downward slope, at the beginning of a downward slope that I noticed physically, I would get up and go. If there was no, SST organizations, I said to myself, yeah, they could get here no problem, get me there no problem. If I knew that there would be a jet waiting to take me and I wouldn't have to sit on a tarmac for 2 hours in a Ziegler case,
Yeah, and just a quick PSA on that. I believe, unless something's changed, for Alcor members, they provide like a $10,000 relocation fee at the end of life. I hope I'm not mistaken, but I believe that was the case.
I don't think that's changed. Yeah, I think that's accurate.
Okay.
Cool. Well, that is that. We'll wrap it up there. Michael, is there anything else you want to let listeners know about or refer them to here at the end of our conversation?
Just keep an eye on BT. If you can share the BT's website, Biostats Technology website as well, that'd be great.
Yep.
And check out the Substack. Sign up for the Substack.
Cool. Yep. All links to that will be over in the description. So be sure to check those out. Sign up for the Substack. Follow what everybody's doing, and This has been wonderful. Michael Benjamin, thank you very much for joining us here on the Cryonics Underground.
And thank you for having me.
Thanks, Michael.
All right, and Michael Benjamin has left our virtual studio. And as folks can probably tell, we are, at least those who are watching on video, we have magically transported to a different place. In fact, to a different time. It's a few days after what happened. Daniel, you look like you've lost 10 pounds. And I look like I'm on a boat somewhere in the Arctic Ocean, because in fact I am. At any rate, we just went back through everything we recorded some days ago, and had some closing thoughts on the conversation. Daniel, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, absolutely. So first off, I want to thank Alcor for actually commissioning this project in the first place. I think it's to their credit that they're going out of their way to actually analyze the effectiveness of these procedures, despite what I imagine were probably some, concerns about the optics of doing this, because always the risk of it not turning out to be particularly flattering. While I can't say I wasn't disappointed with the findings, I still think I have to acknowledge that cryonics is an experiment and that these kinds of road bumps need to be expected. My hope is, though, that people will view this as a catalyst for positive change. I know some are just going to complain about the findings and say it's evidence of things not going well, but I would really like to stress that this perspective isn't really useful or productive towards the general discourse in cryonics, nor the improvement of cryonics. It's pretty unwise to punish an organization for prioritizing introspection and self-improvement. And personally, I'm looking forward to even more analysis of the data, and whatever future changes will be implemented because of the data. So I hope others will follow my lead. In any case, what are your thoughts, Max?
Yeah, I would echo a lot of that, and I would say that the only way that any any of these service organizations can learn, or any cryonics related organization can learn, is by studying what has already been done and figuring out where they could improve. If not, how does one get better at these sorts of things? So I'm glad that this is finally being done, and it's being done in a systematic way and in a careful way, and by somebody as good at this as Michael Benjamin, whom Daniel and I have both met in person now more than once. And at least for me, I can say he's not just an incredibly brilliant mind and dedicated individual, but he's just also a really good person, just somebody you want to spend time with. That's important to me as well, and I think to many people in the industry. So I know that Michael felt that the SMICS captured everything that is, or almost everything that's relevant to actual ischemic damage, rather than just ischemic exposure. But I still believe that in the future we're going to come up with some better way to actually analyze how much ischemic damage was done directly, rather than using these indirect correlates of ischemic damage. So I think that'll be good when we get there, but we're not there yet. And for now, this seems to be a pretty good measure, along with everything else we discussed, of course. And with all this work, hopefully we'll get to a better place, better cryopreservations, higher quality cryopreservations in the years to come. And the kinds of trends that we saw being discussed will be a thing of the past, and we'll switch that to a positive curve there. As always, we will include links down below, including to the original paper on the SMICS scores and a few other things of note. Until next time, this has been the Cryonics Underground podcast, and we will see you all on the next one. Farewell for now.